Good evening and welcome to the monastery. Considering nursing a cold from my long travels, so you'll pardon me. It was rather nice. Last Sunday I was at the cathedral in Boston, the OCA Cathedral, in time for a baptismal liturgy, which was really delightful. And I think a rather remarkable priest there, whom I liked immensely, Father Robert. And it was lovely to arrive there to find myself at the River Jordan for a baptism, and I returned home just in time to celebrate the 27th baptism served here at the monastery this year, and that was also quite delightful. I'm just putting a little preface on the conversations that I had at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center at the University of Maine in Augusta, Maine. I had been at a conference in Boston at Holy Cross Seminary, the conference for people, Orthodox Christians in the medical, psychiatric, psychological services, neuroscience, and that sort of thing. And that was quite a successful conference that perhaps we'll speak about a little later. But I was also invited to the University of Maine at Augusta to have a conversation on human rights, which has been a major part of my life since the late 1950s, and also spoke at the Lewiston campus of the University of Southern Maine, Lewiston-Auburn campus, and had a gathering of students in a Somali restaurant in Lewiston, which was really quite delightful. I have a colleague who teaches in Lewiston that I've known since 1974. We were friends in Alaska many, many years ago. And his wife, Penny, is a nurse practitioner. I think that's a nurse who can actually diagnose and sometimes prescribe for the Veterans Administration. So all in all, it was a marvelous visit. But in the preface, as a preface, I wanted to say that in the introduction that was given me at the Human Rights Center, a little bit of the information is not quite correct. And I realize that, some people would pounce on that instantly and not listen to the content of the talk. But I had spoken 2 years ago at the Greek Church in Portland, Maine. And from the sketchy notes that someone had taken about some information, this was put together rather impromptu just before I began the conversations. So I hope to hear from some of you about the conversations, and I don't mind, of course, people who don't agree with many of the points made. But no vulgarity, please. As my friend Barbara Marie Dreslow likes to point out, I have an aversion to vulgarity. So, but your comments, criticisms, critiques, fine, I'd like to hear from you about it. Anyway, thank you very much, and here's the presentation or the conversation at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of the University of Maine, Augusta campus. Thank you, and God bless.
Okay.
Good evening. Try that again. Good evening. Good evening. Much better. Good Abend. My name is Robert Bernheim, and on behalf of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, University of Maine at Augusta, John Denon, and the Brunswick Rotary Club International, I'd like to welcome you here to a community conversation with Archbishop Lazar. The Archbishop is a hierarch of the Orthodox Church in America. He studied physics at the University of British Columbia, as well as neurobiology, Byzantine history, and patristics at the Warburg Institute, the University of London, and theology at the Holy Trinity Seminary, which is in Jordanville, New York. He's lectured widely, as many of you know, in North America and in Europe on issues of human rights, ecological crisis, and religion and science. The Archbishop has been an activist for women's rights and has challenged men to be in the forefront of the struggle against such things as female circumcision in Africa. He frequently challenges men to realize that it is degrading to men to have our gender defined in some parts of the world by cruel and unjust acts against women. He's written 48 books, some of which are on display and I believe also on sale tonight. So please extend a warm welcome for Archbishop Lazar. Thank you very much.
I hope it'll be a conversation. Get away. I was mentioning earlier about knowing somebody who was on board the USS Portland when it was the last Allied ship still afloat in Guadalcanal, and how part of war that we don't even see in movies usually, that when the ship would be sunk or hit, even the Japanese vessel, you could feel pity. The sailors would have to bail over and they would be picked off one by tiger sharks and consumed. It's an aspect of war that somehow passes us. And we sanitize the language so much now that when innocent civilians are killed, they're simply collateral damage. And it's very dangerous to do that with language, but language is malleable. And language is used in so many different ways. You can reduce things by sanitizing them with language. And that's a very tragic thing to do, with language. So it's, in using language and in speaking, I hope we don't do any of that this evening. I'm going to start by talking about, well, it's a book I'm working on anyway, two axial eras. How many of you are familiar with the great axial era? The axial era. I have to explain it a little bit then before. Between years 800 and 400 BCE, there was an enormous transformation in human thought. We were beginning in that era when people began to think of themselves as having a personhood, as being an actual individual instead of a part of the communal landscape of tribal systems. And thinking about themselves as human beings, they also began to think about life and death in a different way. And to consider the great problems of the day, all the way from China to Miletus, was about permanence and change, and also what is good and evil and where does it come from? The ideas and concepts themselves. And at the same time, people were coming out of tribal ancestries to city-states. Very often the high priest then became a king or a king priest and was somehow, physically related to God or something. And the whole landscape of human history and human communities began to change radically. It resulted, of course, in an aristocracy who served not the community but the king. And they became aristocracy because they served the king. And in these agrarian societies, a great deal of injustice began to develop. So some of the great thinkers of the era, the architects of the great axial era, began to think in terms of humanity. It wasn't really a concept that was there before, the concept of humanity in and of itself. And to think about what was right and what was just. And it was the really emergence of the concept of social justice and of human rights in this axial era that really occupied some of the great minds of that time. Now, it's rather sad the way we use the word justice now. It never, in early Latin or Old Latin, or even the Latin of the time of the Apostles, it never had juridical forensic connotations. Justitita, like dikaiosune in Greek, meant to put things back in right balance. What was morally right. It didn't mean to punish. But so often in our society, justice means to punish somebody. It doesn't mean to restore what's been taken by the government back to the people who rightly ought to have it, or something like that, to rebalance society. And it wasn't until, I think, late Middle Latin that justice took on the concept of punishment, or a really juridical concept. It certainly didn't have that earlier. Even in the Apostles, when it says that Christ justifies, it doesn't say anything like that in the Greek at all. It says Christ fulfilled righteousness for us. Christ made us righteous. And the fulfillment of the law is not punishment, the fulfillment of the law is righteousness. So we began to have a degeneration of the concept of justice. But in the great axial era, everyone from Confucius to the Hebrew prophets, and Hesiod was about the same time as prophet Amos in the northern kingdom, were criticizing the injustice of the aristocracy of the ruling classes. And everyone was looking toward trying to see what the proper relationship in humanity was. Confucius, of course, was in the time of just at the end of the spring and autumn era, the warring states. So if we look at the architects of this axial era, the great thinkers or philosophers that actually began to transform human thought and the consciousness and concept of humanity itself, they were all under the pressure of some sort of catastrophe or some very difficult circumstances that had to be thought out. And every one of them were responding to that as well as responding to the new form that humanity was taking itself. And what was permanent and what was changeable, and whether permanence was real or whether it was imaginary, and whether everything was always changing. That's the time Confucius actually took the Book of Changes, the I Ching, and turned it from being a way of fortune-telling into a philosophy, and developed a philosophy out of it. The grandfather of the axial period was Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, more familiarly called. But Zarathustra was the one who really started the process of thinking about life and death and good and evil, and sort of framing the way we would talk about life and death and good and evil. And probably the first really organized monotheist in history. And he was very concerned with how a ruler should rule, or with what kind of justice. The ruler had an obligation to the lowest in society, not simply to the nobility. And Confucius had some similar concepts, but he was more interested in interhuman relationships and how our relationships would reflect a sense of the other person's humanity. And the Hebrew prophets were probably the most dramatic. The prophet Isaiah, when he says that, we keep these fasts in Israel and in the Orthodox Church as well, on the same schedule as the Jews. So, what kind of a fast is it that God has demanded of us, required of us? Is it not to unloose to set free those who are in bondage and to break every yoke? Is it not to feed the hungry and to clothe the naked? Is it not to lift up the downtrodden and to embrace the poor? And as a matter of fact, one of the prophets says, and invite them into your own home. Something St. John Chrysostom later will say that real charity is when you're willing to invite somebody into your own home, not simply when you're willing to give them a crust of bread. But anyway, these were the great thoughts that were circulating at the time. Isaiah in the southern kingdom of Judea, and Amos and Hosea in the northern kingdom. But they were under the pressure of the impending Assyrian conquest. And thinking very, very deeply at that time, this whole series of Hebrew prophets would say, the reason you've betrayed God is because you don't care for the poor, the widows, the orphan, and the stranger. Because you've abandoned hospitality, and you've abandoned the normal charity to the stranger and the poor and the downtrodden. That this is what God's actually commanded of us. So throughout this whole period, in this great axial era, from the 800s up to about the 400s, this was something that dominated thought, human thought. The school of Miletus, of course, was developing philosophical science, which later became science, at the time. And we didn't see quite so much concern in that school. But what they were concerned with was permanence and change, and looking at the problems of permanence and change and trying to grasp and trying to understand it. And they could see the permanence and change in humanity as well, and in concepts of humanity. Hesiod, one of Homer's associates, was also criticizing the ruling class for their injustice toward the poor and the weak. And out of it developed a concept, basically a concept of commonweal, that is the common good, that followed us down through the Red Tory movement in Britain and into Canada. And there was a resistance to radical individualism, but to recognize the personhood of the individual, that each individual had a personhood that made them a part of humanity. And the whole concept of humanity itself developed and arose in this era. But the best way to override this concern and concept of humanity is to brand somebody as not quite human, to try to make them a little bit subhuman. And after that, the thing is that all hatred comes from fear. There's no other source of hatred but fear. And if you want to have a war, you have to make people afraid of somebody. And when you have enough fear in them, then you make them hate the person. And then it's easy to kill them. It's much easier to put people in the field to kill people. Once you make them afraid of those people, and then you make them hate those people. So you developed in this whole time also a kind of system of propaganda so that you could still go and kill people even though you're beginning to recognize their humanity. And this was a very cruel and vicious age. Few people have been as vicious in history as the Assyrians were. So much so that it was said that when their empire collapsed, the whole world sighed a sigh of relief, heaved a sigh of relief. But nevertheless, these ideas were developing among them. And if you look at one of the great people in that history, Cyrus the Great, who was a very pious Zarathustrian, really fulfilled what he believed when he sent the Jews back to rebuild their temple and financed it, because he respected what they believed. He respected their religion and thought there was something rather special about it because he was a monotheist himself. And but St. Ezra and Nehemiah, who were his advisors, had worked or served as advisors to him back to rebuild the temple and all. But this idea of social justice and human rights was always the victim of various kinds of empire. Because when you want to build an empire, you have to be more superior than other people. You have to be spreading Roman civilization or American democracy or whatever excuse you want for building an empire. And it was always used to make yourself above the others. And if you didn't completely demonize them, they at least were not as civilized. They at least didn't have some kind of divine rights to rule and govern other nations. So that would pass through the medieval era, and democracy itself would begin to develop. But there was a problem with democracy as it developed. If you're going to have an actual democracy, it's all or none. But, there's certain people that really deserve that. Like black people up till the 1960s. We remember, people my age remember when in Alabama or Georgia you could take a black man and hang him for sport and nobody would even call the police. Well, democracy was for white people who owned property, maybe not for white women though, because they couldn't vote until 1920 and women didn't become legal persons until 1930s. So democracy starts to develop and unfold out of the axial era and the concepts of the axial era. People were afraid that democracy would include people they didn't like, or people who weren't quite as good as they were. And till the 1960s, when we began to shift into a new axial era, because from Aristotle and Plato onward, the way society changed very, very slowly, very gently, was a trickle-down from, I don't want to use Reaganism, but it was a trickle-down from the philosophers, would slowly move into society and education and change aspects of the society, the way Immanuel Kant and John Locke fed into the American Constitution and that sort of thing. But then in the 20th century, the trickle-down started to come from scientists and from physicists, and from particularly astrophysicists, from cosmologists. And the philosophers were quite so important anymore, the modern sciences. So people started to think in a completely different way about humanity itself, And we began to say, well, look, democracy has to be all or none. It has to be more inclusive than it was. So in the 1920s, they had to break down and start letting women vote. You know, and in speaking in Canada sometimes to a woman's group, something that probably wouldn't work too well in the United States, but I always sort of look off into space and say, Victoria Vagina of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and their other realms and territories beyond the sea, Queen Empress of India, Supreme Head of the Church of England and Defender of the Faith. But she couldn't vote because she was a woman. She couldn't vote because she was a woman. And women became legal persons in the Commonwealth in 1933, I believe. Before that. So we saw this expansion and opening up of human rights and civil, including more and more people in it. And at the same time, there was a great reaction against it. But I think the younger generation now have come to grips with the flaws and faults of some of our, prejudices and some of our groups, and started to look beyond what we understood, that humanity includes all human beings, not just certain human beings. And probably the Second World War had a great deal to do with it. Because when we look at what did take place in the Second World War, unfortunately it wasn't something new. The pogroms in Chisinau in 1903, in what was then Bessaraba, but is now Republic of Moldova, were among the most unnerving and cruel and vicious things that we've seen in human history, where infants were literally ripped apart while they were still alive. People were thrown out third, fourth, fifth floor windows, and everything they owned was sacked. These are great pogroms against the Jews that were taking place, and probably the origin of Zionism, because as Golda Meir was from that region of Ukraine, and she once said that we lived always with the knowledge that something bad was going to happen to us, and it was going to happen because we were Jews. Fortunately, she got to immigrate to North America. But if we look at this now, the Holocaust itself and these pogroms, we can't say that was only about the Jews, because it's all humanity. This has something to say about all of humanity and the things that humans can do to each other. And the Holocaust taught us anything, it's that none of us are safe from hatred and malice and persecution. Here, one whole race of people, not a religion, but the whole race. Some of the Jews who were sent to the concentration camps have been Roman Catholic for a few generations, because, in order to enter the Hungarian army, you had to become Roman Catholic, you couldn't be Jewish. So people did, and they became officers. And when the Nazis came, they sent forensic clerks in to check through all of the records in the cities and the towns and the villages. And they would go back generations and find out in all these countries who had been baptized, who hadn't been baptized. There were no baptismal records, there might be Jews. So then you preserved all the wedding records and all these things, all the way back. And sometimes somebody who hadn't been Jewish by religion for 4 or 5 generations, they would still be arrested and sent off. So it was the extermination of an entire race of human beings. And if you stop to think about it, in the great axial era, the whole concept of humanity arose. That people were human beings, and that they had personhood. That there was a reality to their existence. That was the great shift in the axial era, was into the concept of humanity and the reality of human existence of the human person, as well as everything else that developed in that era. And then suddenly we come along to a certain period in history when we're supposed to have risen to a new height in having a democracy. We find a nation trying to exterminate a whole race of human beings. And in the beginning, nobody reacting to it. Nobody reacting to it. It was the shelling of Gdansk and the invasion of Poland that people reacted to, not the attempt to exterminate a whole race of human beings. And we have to think of what was deficient. And we saw it again in Rwanda. We had one Canadian general there who was with the United Nations and helpless with a little crew of people. And he would actually, literally on television in tears, weeping, begging the United Nations and others to send somebody to help stop that genocide. But there wasn't any oil in the oil. And they were the wrong color. So nobody came. And we see what happened in that case. So we've risen to a certain height. And we have a certain concept of human rights. But we also have a lot of people in our own countries, in countries like with the British system, of democracy, who think that there's something seriously wrong with the whole concept of human rights and the whole concept of a universal humanity. And then we wonder, what is all of our preaching and our teaching and our gospels and the Old Testament prophets or the Hebrew prophets and all the things that the Buddha taught and what Confucius tried to accomplish. What good are all those things in the face of what we allowed to happen in the 20s, 30s, and 40s? You know, we had eugenics in the province of Alberta as well as in Georgia and Alabama. The attempt to sterilize people who were the wrong race, the wrong color, or we thought they were mentally deficient, or we pretended they were mentally deficient because we didn't like their race or something. And those things took place here. None of us are innocent of them. So this is something that I thought I wanted to say here in this place because of what this place is and what it stands for. And there are not very many of us here, but think about, who would you like to exterminate? Who do you think should be erased from the face of the earth? I mean, who does your doctrine or dogma tell you doesn't really have a right to exist? We're still not clean. We still haven't got past that. We still think that we can say there's black and white in the human condition, but there's only shades of gray. The absolute is not a synonym for truth, it's a synonym for an ossified mind. And almost everyone that we might hate or be prejudiced against is only because of fear. Because fear breeds hatred. And hatred breeds malice, and malice breeds murder. And this is the thing we haven't quite grasped. I'm very proud of the younger generation that they don't buy into our prejudices and don't buy into many of our values, because some of our values, frankly, really suck. Even the term values, it's not a term that belongs in philosophy or theology, because it's mercantile. When you talk about human values, you're saying, what is a human worth? How much is a human worth? And now we've been corporatized as consumers, so our value is set by how much we consume. Because we're corporatized now into consumer capitalism. And our value rests upon how much we consume. It doesn't matter. I mean, look at how people regard some of the Somalis here. They've opened businesses, they've gone to work, they've cleaned up parts of the city, they've done all these things, but do they consume enough to be worth anything? And that corporatization of humanity is what we came to through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and perhaps even in part of the 1800s. And the younger generation, of course, don't grasp it, they don't buy into it as much. And I think it's very hopeful, but I think some of us should try to learn from the younger generation to lighten up and to look at humanity in a better way. Because part of this new axial era we're in is formed by communications. Time, distance, and space don't mean the same thing anymore. And they don't mean the same thing at all to a younger generation. I mean, people have Facebook friends in Malaysia, in China, Japan, in Russia, in Norway, in Sweden. And they see things from this bigger perspective or greater perspective. And I was going to call it the People's Spring, but I suppose we shouldn't. That's based on the idea of the Prague Spring, when Dubček led the rebellion against the communists in the Prague Spring. Now we have the Arab Spring. And driven a lot by technology and the things that people, immediate communications and a grasp of what's going on everywhere in the world. And you can do it almost instantaneously. We can sit down now and go on the computer and we can read the Frankfurter Allgemeine, and then we can read the Borba from Belgrade, and we can read the Pravda, and we can see Chinese newspapers that are published in English because we can't read those. But so we see all of these things, and we can compare the news stories, and we can see the different perspectives on different things. So it's a little bit more difficult to just load people down with propaganda. I like Al Jazeera, but I don't like Fox News. But it's the thing is, we can see what the rest of the world is saying and how they're focusing on the same issues. And when you look at what happened in the Second World War, what happened in Rwanda, we realize that the real source of evil is a lack of empathy, a lack of a feeling toward humanity. And that the book of Leviticus, as well as Christ in the Gospels, made everything contingent on our interhuman relations, on the empathy that we would have one for another. You know, love your neighbor as yourself, and don't do to others what you wouldn't have to do them to do to you. Not very many murderers want to be murdered. Not many thieves want to be stolen from. Not many slanderers want to be slandered. Not many people who teach hate want to be hated. They teach hate because they want to be loved. So do to others what you would have them do it to you. And I think in the Hebrew it says, cherish and nourish your neighbor as yourself. Maybe I'm wrong. But to care about your neighbor, to have empathy for your neighbor, to love your neighbor. And as Mohandas Gandhi once perhaps famously said, the problem with Christians is they don't pay any attention to Christ. When I travel when I speak at universities, sometimes a dozen in a year. And as long as I'm off the West Coast where we have a lot of Buddhists and Sikhs and Hindus in British Columbia anyway, every university, I go under full sail usually, even more than I'm wearing this evening. And consequently, no matter what I'm lecturing on, religion comes up. So I like to ask students, particularly in America, because other countries aren't necessarily Christian, don't consider themselves Christian countries. How many of you were raised in a Christian family? It was about 90% of those who were born before the 1990s. After that, it's more like 50%. And I ask how many of you are still Christians? It's about 3 to 4%. So I asked why you rejected Christianity. In 35, almost 37 years, I have never one time had the answer Darwin or evolution. It has never been the problem. And no one has ever mentioned it to me as a reason for renouncing Christianity. Yet Christians use it as a scapegoat because they want to instill fear in people. You know, you get these people about, dinosaurs aren't here because they wouldn't fit on the ark or something. And I have to tell them, look, I'm sorry to tell you, I don't want to offend anybody, but the Flintstones was not a documentary. But it's hypocrisy and bigotry are the biggest reasons. Christian hypocrisy and bigotry are the biggest reasons. And all you have to do is look at one televangelist and you see exactly what they mean. Every earthquake is because God's irritated with somebody. It's moral fascism. God's an old man sitting on the outer rim of the universe with a bunch of fetishes. And if you violate one of his fetishes, he'll do something really horrible to you, like send a tornado or an earthquake or a famine or, at the time you finish listening to it, you think, I couldn't buy a used car from him. It's, let alone worship him, Humans are better. So this is part, but it's all about instilling fear so that you can make some profit from the fear. And you always have to have a scapegoat. I think one of the saddest things when I went to Dachau, everybody was represented by the color of their armband, except the gay people. Why? Because it was perfectly all right to exterminate them because they weren't us. Unless they were Jewish. See? Then we're outraged that they were exterminated. Everybody in the world who put that monument together thought it was perfectly all right to exterminate that group of people. I never thought about what the ramifications or what it meant. Every nation in the North Atlantic Alliance, every nation in Europe thought it was perfectly all right to exterminate that group of people because they weren't us. They were the other. But there is no other. We're all variations on a theme in the great symphony of humanity. There is no the other. We're all variations on a theme in the symphony of humanity. There's no the other, unless we ourselves are the other. And that's one of the tragedies of our generation, our age, our modern world. And I hope the younger generation are rising above all that. So there's no group of humans that it's right to exterminate them from the face of the earth. exterminate every last Jew from the face of the earth. But it was all right to exterminate this group of people because they weren't us. And there's still enough people here in the United States who'd like to exterminate that group of people and wipe them off the face of the earth without ever thinking that it's nothing in the world but another Holocaust of people who are not us for some reason. So that should be a warning signal to everyone. Everyone should go home and write down a whole list of people you hate and a whole list of people you're prejudiced against. And then try to write a meaningful paragraph about each one of them, why you hate them, why you're prejudiced against them. If it's your doctrine or your dogma, forget it. That's not where it's at. You know, faith collapses into religion, religion collapses into ideology, and then it becomes just another form of politics. And it has no vitality, nothing alive anymore in it, nothing that's transforming, nothing that's changing, nothing that lifts you higher. But when your religion becomes an ideology, it drags you down to the lowest level of humanity. And you tie it and bind it together with your politics, and then your politics reshape your religion instead of the other way around. And deform your mind. And this is one of the tragedies of our own time. In the 1960s, you know, we had people worried about the feminazis, the women's movement. That before the 1920s, you know, if women get to vote, society as we know it will collapse. The world as we know it will come to an end because women get to vote. Nobody could tell you why, but they were absolutely certain that it would be a real social catastrophe if women got to vote. And then women got to vote and nothing happened. You know, we still haven't had a female president yet. And Maggie Thatcher proved that a head of a state can be just as savage as any man can, and just determined. You know. So these are some of the issues that, you know, I'm going to stop talking and see if we can have some kind of a dialogue or something. Because they're issues that somehow tear at the soul. And we really look around and say, all the energy that we spend hating somebody, all the energy we spend condemning or demonizing somebody, is it really worth it to spend all that energy on something like that? You see those little light bulbs that appear over your eye when you get an idea in the cartoons. We should have some of these new sort of fluorescent light bulbs appearing over our heads and not waste quite so much energy that way. It's anyway, by some means we still survive and we still go on, and there's still Jews in this world, and there's still black people in this world. Now it's amazing. I mean, it's wonderful that America has a black president. I don't care what else anybody thinks about him. The fact that it was an enormous social breakthrough. I mean, it could have been Hillary, but whatever anybody thinks about her, it would have been a woman president. It could have been a social breakthrough, a breakthrough for society itself, no matter whether she was good, bad, or indifferent. The fact that people had overcome this prejudice this way, had overcome this hatred, had overcome this demonization, would have been an enormous social breakthrough. And it didn't matter which one it was an enormous social breakthrough. So to revisit the concept of humanity, and I wouldn't say the dignity of the individual, but the dignity of personhood, the dignity of the person. And somehow you can have an individual lion or an individual barracuda or an individual, you know, possum or something, but a person. The kind of humanity and the human dignity that people deserve. It's like seeing people on street people, and somebody will look at them and say, "Oh, filthy bum, why don't you get a job?" And somebody else knows how to look at them in a way that certifies their humanity or verifies their humanity. And that's, of course, what we should all strive for. They can see in the look of our eyes not pity, but the recognition of their humanity in it. So that's, anyway, that's what I would hope for amongst us. So anybody have any questions or anything? Yeah.
When you said the younger generation, that's so general,
Yeah.
because when I think of the young generation, I know that there were gang wars. I don't know too much about it now, but they have, hates and they have enemies and in the United States and parts of it, and it's frightening because, there's people who are collateral, what do you say,
Collateral damage.
from their wars too, and it's so, it seems to be a never-ending part of life.
It can seem that way. At the same time, you find 8, 9-year-old kids who have started funds to raise money for kids in other countries.
Mhm.
And you see things like that happen as well at the same time. We have gang wars. I mean, once upon a time they were called knights or crusaders or something. And they are an image of our society. They're an image of our society itself. But, there are all kinds of issues and problems one has to look at in those things. I mean, a lot of young people join a gang because they're desperate to belong to something. They're desperate for limits and boundaries set on them by some system, which they don't have anymore. And they want some kind of tribal identity. And somehow, Christian isn't the tribal identity of choice anymore. It doesn't have much of an impact in the world because of our hypocrisy and bigotry and because of our abandonment of the teachings of Jesus Christ and replacing it with, moralism. I mean, from a strictly Orthodox Christian point of view, morality can become a heresy. Morality becomes a heresy when it becomes a substitute for a life in Christ. And the life in Christ is very simple. Love God with all of your being. Have empathy for your neighbor. Have love amongst yourselves. Do to others what you'd have them do to you. And if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And those are the commandments. I mean, he was repeating the Hebrew prophets. I mean, he was in the whole tradition of the Hebrew prophets and the rabbinical tradition. The same rabbinical tradition that used so many parables to teach. But what happens is that we manage to pass on enough to our children, or make them feel abandoned enough, or approach social issues with moralism. When you approach a social issue with moralism, you have no hope of ever resolving or solving it. And it's even like the way we treat this so-called war on drugs, which nobody really wants to win because sale of narcotic amounts to some billions of dollars in the American economy. So nobody wants to really end it. They just want to, it's a sop to people. There's far too much money involved in it. And you can't take the steps that would eradicate that, because prohibition never works. All it does is arm criminals. Without the prohibition, I mean, Seagrams and these other people never would have been rich. The whole Canadian alcohol industry was built around trying to send alcohol to America, and it became wars. And people were being killed because there was a lot of money in it. It's just like, trying to ban marijuana. I mean, in Canada, nobody gets arrested for smoking it in public. It's only for selling it. They have it for your own use, fine. But in that way, you break some of the power of the gangs, and you also put some of the organized crime out of the picture. Because as long as there's a lot of money to be made, people do. And you can't say the politicians have a will to do it, because as the late John Diefenbaker, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker said, there are two places for criminals, prison and parliament. But, all you need to get elected is enough votes and a good alibi. And you can buy a senator just as easily as you can buy a member of parliament. So, I mean, there's money involved. There's always corruption and degeneracy. But a lot of young people, and a lot of even the movie stars and these big singers and all that, and some of these people actually go to Africa and do hands-on charity in ways that you wouldn't have seen in the 50s or something, because they are motivated by something higher. And I think very hopeful. I mean, I see all the problems going on as well, but I still think it's very hopeful in the fact that the younger people have distanced themselves from a lot of our prejudices and a lot of our malice and hatred, and started to look in this new axial era, not just toward the rest of the world, but toward the universe itself. This is a Carl Sagan world. This is the world of Isaac Asimov and of Stephen Hawking. It's not the world of Immanuel Kant anymore. Anybody who tries different era, and it is changing the way people think, and changing, in some ways, the structure of the brain itself. So who knows where the transformation will go, but it's better than more of the same.
I was going to say, I find that there's a lot of hope with the new generations, and I think it really depends on honestly the area you're living in. Where I grew up, there's no games. There's a biker group, but that was it, and they kept to themselves. The city took care of itself. The city wouldn't allow for gangs to come in, and the people in general, all the generations would get together, and they wouldn't allow for that. And it's the same way now. It's still not. There's no gangs in my hometown, and the newer generations growing up without an area that you don't have to deal with something like that gives you a lot of hope.
Yeah.
And I think that's becoming in other areas as well. A lot of towns are starting to take care of themselves, and it's good to see that people are sticking on.
Well, some of the examples, though, that also I rather enjoy. I have a son who teaches in the United States, and I notice his mentality changes from a Canadian over a number of years. And in city near us, which is sort of the buckle on the Bible Belt, we don't have much of a Bible Belt in Canada, but anyway, this is in our area. There was a lot of bullying of gay kids in the public school, and the administration wouldn't do anything about it because they're Alliance Church or some kind of fundamentalist or something, so they thought it was just great. So the kids got together and formed an anti-bullying brigade. The heterosexual kids. Because they knew it was wrong and they wanted to put a stop to it. And if the adults wouldn't do it, they were going to do it themselves, and they did it. They cleaned it up. That's the sort of thing that I see as hopeful. It's even like when we wanted to save the Great Bear Rainforest, there were a lot of teenagers involved in it to keep them from logging where the spirit bear lives. And that was a lot of, it was really a young people's movement, and some of us old fogies from the 60s. But it was marvelous, really.
First of all, thanks very much for a very interesting talk. It's quite interesting that the two questions you've had so far all focused on your observation about youth. And it was actually what came across to me as well as a hopeful statement. And anecdotally, I actually think that I believe that. I watch the kids in our community that they haven't bought into our prejudices and our hatred. Things like homophobia.
Yeah.
They don't even understand it. There will always be exceptions, but more so than not, they are definitely not like me or not like my generation.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very hopeful thing.
It is. It's not universal with all youth, of course, but as a matter of fact, it is fairly broad when you look at the overall picture in it. And even when I talk to Islamic kids in Damascus or Istanbul or Amman, the younger generation who can't. This one kid said, why are we supposed to hate Shiites? We're all Muslims. So we're Ahmadi or something, Why do we have to hate the Ahmadi? So, the Muslims are parts of Pakistan and India. We're all supposed to be Muslims. Why do we hate each other? I don't know. Go back and ask the architects of the 30 Years' War. Maybe they can tell you why 40% of the population of Europe had to die because they weren't all Lutherans or they weren't all Calvinists. That's where de Groot came up with the idea of international law. Was after the 30 Years' War. And he was put in prison in France shortly after he came up with the idea. But anyway, yeah.
It's interesting because I guess I'm a cynic because I spent time going to school in Texas, and there was a park that was fairly close to our high school. Yeah. And shockingly enough, in the mid to late 80s, there was a tradition in this high school, and it was called Friday night football game, Saturday night gay bashing, and the football players would go to this park and look for homosexual men who frequented it, damage their cars, assault them, harass them. And the school they knew about it. The school looked the other way, the police looked the other way, everybody looked the other way. And I was talking about it years later with my dad, and my dad said, well, when I was in high school, it was blacks.
Yeah.
He said, when you were in high school, it was gays.
Yeah.
He said, you go back there now, I guarantee you it will be Mexicans.
Yeah.
I don't think, I think they just want somebody else to hate. I don't really see a sense that in certain areas that there's hope. I think they just kind of said, okay, well, you know, blacks are now accepted, we're not quite so homophobic, but now it's the Mexicans. They're taking our jobs, they're coming
Chico's
in.
is not Mexican.
Yeah.
No, you have kind of cycles like that, but nevertheless, it's not something that is far from being universal. But so much of that reflects what we've taught and what we've passed on to the young people. It's really young people born after the 90s who are the better ones, and in the 90s and after the 90s, that have a different perspective or a broader perspective on it. But I mean, what happens? They come home and somebody's saying, oh, those spics taking all the jobs, you know, those WAPs and those Chicos and all that, they're coming and taking all the jobs and getting all the welfare checks and things. So of course they grow up with hearing that. What do you expect of them? Because that's what their parents are telling them and teaching them. You know, no one is born knowing how to hate. No one is born with prejudices. We have to teach them how to hate, and we have to teach them how to kill, and we have to teach them prejudices. And we do a very fine job of it still. That's part of the issue. I mean, I remember as a boy, I moved on my own at the age of 15 because it was 100 degrees warmer in Vancouver than it was where we lived. And I lived with the Ukrainian family in Vancouver, and they had an old person from Volyn in Ukraine. And he was constantly teaching them to hate Polish people. If they'd been from a little farther east, he would have been teaching them to hate Russians, but as it was, he was teaching them to hate Poles. And because there was a Polish Empire once upon a time, you know, the Poles were weeping because they were under the Russian Empire, the German Empire. They had an empire of their own, and they did it to others in their turn. And so he was teaching them this intense hatred of Polish people, and they were repeating it. They didn't play cowboys and Indians; they play Ukrainians and Polacks, or something. We have to teach them this stuff. They're not born with this stuff. You know, that's part of the issue and part of the project. It takes a long time to breed that out of a society and a culture. I mean, you know, the Ku Klux Klan burned synagogues and they burned black Christian churches. You didn't care whether you were Jew or Christian. They were just the other. As long as you were the other, they were going to burn you out. You remember Billie Holiday went to prison, actually, more or less as a result of singing that song, you know, Strange Fruit, about black men hanging from a tree like fruit on the vine. And those days are past, at least. We progress. The younger generation is progressing, and especially this particular younger generation. You know, a lot of things I have to say the Orthodox Church won't accept. We're never going to have same-sex marriages, and we're never going to have women in the priesthood. But at the same time, why should society care? Why should the rest of the country care? It's within our community, ourselves, we have something. But why should we be trying to agitate or stir up the rest of the community, or even teach our own people that it's because of hatred? You have some theologian. Tchaikovsky tried to commit suicide several times when he was a teenager because he was gay. You know, I mean, we would have lost a tremendous treasure if he'd managed when he was 16 years old to actually drown in that water when he went in. By the time when he was 18, tried to give himself pneumonia because he didn't want his family to be shamed by his suicide. He wanted to kill himself. He had a total nervous breakdown when they tried to force him to get married, and they had to send him off to Italy to recover. They said, well, we got the Capriccio Italiano, but that was nice. Then he went off and had an affair with Camille Saint-Saëns. So, this is, these are the parts of it. Okay, I could say, well, we don't agree with, we don't accept, and things like that. Okay, that's fine. You know, somebody told me to say why I didn't say something because I was an authority figure. No, I'm an authority within the Orthodox Church. Outside the Orthodox Church, I'm just an old man who dresses funny. So I can say what we believe and what teach within our framework. But that's the problem that's the thing with anti-hate laws. You know, every religion has the right to teach all the hatred and malice it wants within the confines of its own sanctuaries. And you can teach all the hatred and malice you want in the privacy of your own home. But we don't like people teaching hatred and malice publicly. Even though that's part of the issue.
I observed as you listed a number of the genocides, I think you made some reference to First Nations, but you didn't say anything about the Native Americans in the United States, I think. Was that just out of
Well, no,
courteous
you know,
because
I
you're
wouldn't have
here.
thought of it because we didn't have that experience in Canada, but of course it was in the United States.
But you
But
listed
I
a
think it was
number of
British
them in
soldiers who
Europe.
gave the blankets that were infected with smallpox. But, you know, but the genocide was horrid, and the ethnic cleansing from Kentucky and Tennessee, where you know the Cherokees already had an alphabet, they already started writing, they already had schools, and they were all packed up and sent off to some horrendous place in the tornado belt, and that was a genocide and ethnic cleansing. You see, it's only bad when somebody else does it. It's not bad when we do it. You know. I mean, look at the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, because it's very important to look at it beyond the surface. Because, first of all, there's Jasenovac. The Jasenovac's death camp in Croatia, because Croatians were part of the Nazi, axis. And they would go into a public school, a grammar school, a grade school, and take all the children out and slaughter them. And then there were these big pits or mine things where they threw their bodies. Sometimes they throw them and they're still alive. And just before the war broke out and Yugoslavia was breaking apart, it was just a year after they started opening these mass graves of all the Serbian children who were killed. You know, sometimes the Ustasha made rosary beads out of human eyeballs ripped out of Serbs. So there was a huge amount of fear when this happened. And all the Serbs were, what's going to happen to us again? That's what Bojana really said when, well, we reacted out of fear because we were afraid it was all going to happen again. But that gave the two demagogues, Karadzic was mad as a habit, he was a psychopath, and Mladic wasn't much better. But because of the fear, they could come in and take over and do what they wanted, because everybody was terrified and these people were going to protect us. And that's why. So people have to look beyond that, because the Jasenovac's death camp in Croatia was where they exterminated, 500,000 Serbs were killed there. Every gypsy in Yugoslavia was killed there. There were thousands of Jews killed there. To pretend that Jasenovac didn't exist. That wasn't, that's part of the issue, And people need to look at it beyond the surface. Because of course you have to demonize the Serbs because you're going to fight against them because, for some reason. But there's more to that story than what occurred on the surface. I was in Herzegovina where my grandfather grew up, and I saw some of the mass graves of the Serbian children. I saw hundreds of bodies down in that pit. Little bones. Well, probably it was terrifying from the game. That was the fear was the motivator in the whole picture. And it's a tragedy. But when we finally decide that all human beings are worth protecting, and not just the ones who have oil to exploit, that all genocide is evil, not just in countries where there's oil or something, or where we have a vested interest of some kind. And we're not going to go anyplace.
Well, the other thing I noticed, you kind of stopped with Rwanda, and yet there's,
Well, you could have gone on to other parts of Africa.
which is where they're currently genocide. And I just wondered if you had.
Oh yeah,
any
no,
reflections.
there's genocide going on in several places in the world.
And I wondered if you.
And the other thing though, that we sometimes don't think about either, during the war in Libya, there are 3 girls who fled from school and headed for home, and they were raped by Gaddafi's troops. When they got home, because they'd been raped, their father slit their throats. Stop and think about that for a moment. Because they had been raped, their father slit their throats. Because it had changed the family and they weren't worth, didn't have any more value. We've had a couple of honor killings in Canada too, which we have to take special steps about.
Well, there are a lot more than.
So it's going on. I mean, there are a lot of issues in the world right now, and genocide is one of them. And even look what happens to the Uyghurs.
When you talk about the women's rights,
Yeah.
I mean, a lot more than 3 that's happened to.
Oh, of course.
Where
Tens of thousands.
rape is used as a weapon
in war.
Sudan and.
Every place. And actually, even what was happening down in southern Sudan, you didn't get a real response from the West. In that whole area down there, 8-year-old girls were being raped to death, if you want to speak about that, literally. And these troops would come in and massacre hundreds of people, and nobody responded to that. Nobody in the world responded. any value or any vested interest in it. I mean, I went to Parliament myself several times because I'm the civil liaison to the Canadian, to all levels of Canadian government for the church in Canada. And I went and talked about it. And, well, we can't be every place, you know. Well, yeah, but at least you could say something, for God's sake. You don't even make a statement about it. You know, I mean, you didn't even condemn it. And that's part of the tragedy, isn't it? We don't have a vested interest, we don't pay any attention to it. I mean, look at the Horn of Africa. You know, what have we did? We had some troops in Somalia once upon a time, and then they came back, and for the first time in history, some Canadian soldiers were put on trial and put in prison for torturing Somalis. And they called it, we didn't have something like that before. But, you know, it's just, I mean, look at the catastrophes that do go on, we don't respond. I mean, were we ever going to, you know, that little part of Somalia, Somaliland that became an independent nation, has been a jewel in development and growth, and even in democracy. Nobody will recognize it because they broke away from Somalia. So, I mean, you know, we don't see any real common sense or reason to some of these things. But you know very well that these genocides going on, and we won't ignore them, we won't pay attention to them. So.
Is there hope?
Well, yeah, there is. I mean, you know, we don't tolerate those things the way we used to. At least we don't, you know, as a human race, we don't tolerate them the way we used to. What worries me the most is that, you know, I've been in the Middle East enough to know that the next war has to be over water. At least it's a motivator. That whole northern portion of Syria that in the time of the East Roman Empire, or Byzantine as Western people call it, used to be part of the breadbasket of the empire. And it's totally desiccated now. There's not even an aquifer anymore. It's totally brown and burnt out. You know, we went on a tour of it 3 years ago and went through the whole area, and it's gone. And the Sea of Galilee is now, what, 10 feet shallower than it used to be?
At least.
Because there's not enough water flowing into it. So much water is being taken out of the Jordan. Even the Dead Sea is drying up. So, because there's not enough water going in anymore. And the idea of the Turks, you know, damming up the Tigris and Euphrates upstream, of course, has everybody downstream in hysteria because it could be a real catastrophe in it. But there isn't enough water to go around. And then, you know, this is one of the things that, you know, I have to say, to be honest as I can. I can't be totally honest. Some of our religious ideas that are models of reality from a time, from an era when we didn't know as much as we know, are part of the problem. For example, our Roman Catholic brethren are strictly against any kind of conception control or the use of condoms, even to prevent disease. Well, I think they have now yielded and said that prostitutes can use condoms. But you think of the damage that does. With 8 billion people in this world, there'll be double that number in a couple of decades. And we can't feed what we have, and we don't have enough water for the ones we have. So, I mean, what's wrong with people's minds? They have this inane, meaningless religious doctrine about not having conception control of any kind. It says, okay, fine, sell the Vatican and feed all these people and sell everything in it. Or even from our own people, you know, sell cathedrals and feed people. But, you know, we don't have that kind of regulation. We have other things that are wrong. And it's just, we're locked into models of reality, which are the sources of most of our conflicts anyway. Reality itself, in truth, isn't the source of our conflicts. It's our models of reality that are the problem. And if we sat down and list all the places where there was some kind of genocide going on, whether it was the Uyghurs in Chinese Turkestan or whatever, we'd still have some pretty hefty numbers. You know, at least most of us are shocked by it nowadays. That might be an improvement. So anyway.
Well, we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
I was just going to ask you in regards to human rights and the death penalty, especially like within the U.S.
Yeah.
Like, have you done talks at all about the death penalty?
Well, I don't think any civilized nation does have a death penalty. And Texas is not a civilized nation. People eat barbecued possum on the premises. There was a website in Texas for a long time called GalileoWasWrong.org. They were trying to prove that the sun actually goes around the earth. That's, thank heavens Christ wasn't a fundamentalist. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath wasn't the statement of a fundamentalist. He was the Hebrew prophet, in the tradition of the Hebrew prophet. So, anyway, that's
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I would encourage you, if you have further questions or want to continue that conversation with the Archbishop, we can do so informally. And again, there are some refreshments outside. But thank you all for your indulgence to postpone the beginning of this for an hour or so, and glad to have other folks who could make it a little bit later. And Archbishop, thank you so much for your time. So thank you.
I was pretty sure the Flintstones was a duck.